dissertation research, but also some contextualization around book banning and sort of history behind book bans, why book bans take place, what is a book challenge versus a book ban, and then some kind of final thoughts. And I've about an hour to talk, but I might finish a little bit early because I want to give some time to just have a conversation with everyone here as well about just questions you might have, thoughts you might have as well, because I think it's really important to have a dialogue around this thing as well. So, just to get started, I want to give you a little roadmap about how tonight's going to progress. So, first of all, I have a little bit of an about me, just talking about my background with the research I'm doing. Some slides about contextualizing book bans, so understanding how we got where we are. Introduction to my research, how I went about doing my dissertation, some analysis, and some early or some conclusions from that study as well. So, just to give you a sense of what's going to be covered tonight, just going through all those things. So, first off, and about me, so this is a picture of me back in 2017. So, this is me when I was a high school English teacher in South Texas. I did my undergrad at Texas A&M University. I'm from Texas originally. I grew up in South Texas, so about far down south as you can go, down by the border of Mexico. And so, I was a high school English teacher back in 2017. I had set out when I first did this, I thought I was gonna be a high school teacher for life. I was an English major, was all set to do this. And before I actually started teaching, I took a class. I forget the course number, but it was called Young Adult Literature, and it was about banned books. So I had never heard about a banned book actually until I took that class. I came into the classroom and the syllabus said, "Oh, we're doing this about banned books." And so I said, "Well, what's a banned book?" And the first lesson we did that week was talking about banned books or these books that aren't allowed in schools or libraries and been taken out of them for one reason or another. And I thought back and I thought, well, I don't remember there being books that I couldn't read when I was a student. I don't know if anyone here can think about anything. If there are books that maybe your parents didn't let you read, that maybe your school librarian said weren't allowed to be read. I certainly couldn't think of anything. And so the idea of a banned book was something that was very, very new to me. And so in this banned books course, we read through a lot of different books that had been banned. We read through, let me think, Judy Blume's Beloved, for example. I think some other ones. I believe we read through the Grimm fairy tales because those have also been banned before, many, many years ago. But S.E. Hinton's The Outsiders, just a lot of different books that have been challenged or banned from schools or libraries for one reason or another. And so I loved the class. It was fantastic. It was great talking about these things, thinking about why these books might have been banned. But when I was taking this class, then I thought to myself, well, I'm a junior right now. I'm supposed to enter the classroom in 2017. I'm supposed to be a high school teacher. I couldn't possibly experience a book ban in my classroom. Like, that's not going to happen. And if you can think, see where this is going, that was not the case when I started teaching. So this is a photo of me from when I was teaching high school back in 2017. Now, when I started teaching, the school assigned me a book for summer reading for my students. So summer reading being a book assigned to students that they're supposed to read through over the summer and then do a short essay or reflection about it. And the first couple weeks of school are kind of reflecting on that and talking about the book in question. And so the book that was assigned was um, Luis Rodriguez's Always Running, and it's a memoir about his experiences living in Los Angeles during the 70s, and it explores his experience as a person of color, as a person as part of the Latinx community, and why it is that people become involved with gangs and why it becomes a cycle it perpetuates for generation of generation. And he wrote this as a memoir, but also because his son at the time was getting involved in gangs as well, and so he wrote this with the intention of showing his son, these are my experiences. In the 70s as a adolescent, I want you to take these experiences and not repeat the same things that I did. And so I read through this as part of our summer reading assignment, and it was such a powerful book, really, really great piece of literature. And so I started building up my lessons. It was, I believe, early July when I got assigned this. And so I spent the next couple of weeks reading through it, developing lessons, thinking about how am I going to make sure I engage my students with this. And so, Meet the Teacher Night was, I believe, end of the month. And so, right before Meet the Teacher Night, I believe it was 1 or 2 days before, I got an email from our district saying that the students were no longer going to have Always Running their curriculum. It was they were not allowed to bring it to school. They couldn't read it in class or anything. They could not. It was not part of the curriculum. Basically, don't do anything with the book anymore. I asked my manager and said, "Hey, like, what do we do about this book? What do we do with the summer reading assignments?" And he said, "Just give them all A's. And we're not going to talk about this book anymore." And so, for all intents and purposes, this book was banned. It was no longer allowed in the curriculum. It was no longer allowed in my students' hands. Um, I'll mention too, Meet the Teacher Night was just a couple days later, and they got a letter saying that this was no longer in the curriculum. And so I had questions from students and parents asking, well, what am I supposed to do? Like, I give you my assignment for the summer? I had parents saying, hey, like we spent 15 or $20 on this book. Like, what are we supposed to do with this? Like, my kid can't even bring it to school anymore. Um, and so I had all of these questions and not a lot of answers. I was just 22 years old when this happened. And so we're seeing then my first year, within before the school year even started, I experienced a book ban. And this is not the first. There's a second book on the screen here, which is Toni Morrison's Beloved, which is purchased for my students a class set. So 120 books are bought for them. These are brought to my classroom, I think, like sometime September or October. And I was ready to, again, developing curriculum for this, make sure they're ready to learn this thing. And I got another email. This is no longer in the curriculum. And I asked my manager, what am I supposed to do? And he said, this is no longer being taught. Find something else to teach. And so in the span of 1 year, I had two books in my curriculum banned then. And so this was such a significant experience for me because I had thought about potentially returning to graduate school and potentially doing some research. And I didn't really know what I want to do it on. But having gone through this experience of seeing what is it like experiencing a book ban myself, seeing what it's like in terms of students affected, as a teacher, how hard it is to navigate that. And then just generally, why is that people ban books? Because I get this question a lot. Do you know why people ended up asking these books to be removed? And I don't. No one ever told me. And so I had to go the entire year not knowing this. And I never got an answer as to why these were removed. But I really was interested in learning more about this. And so that kind of led me down this path of looking at banned books and challenged books and thinking about why is it that people ban or challenge books, and also what are people saying about these books that get banned and challenged? So we've had a chance to look a little bit about me. Let's talk about bans versus challenges because I mentioned bans and challenges a second ago. I think it's important for tonight that we set up what the difference is between the two of them. So first, I want to go over a ban, and this is just kind of my definition for it. But a ban is the removal of a title from a collection. So that means it's been taken out of a collection or out of curriculum for one reason or another. Um, and so, like with the case before, with me, with my books, these were banned because they were taken out of the curriculum. There was a reason given, or well, no reason given in my case, but they were taken out of the curriculum. A challenge is sort of the precursor to a ban or removal. And a challenge is what happens when someone requests that a book be removed from a collection or curriculum. And so this can look like a lot of different things. It happens in a lot of different ways. So the more formal way of doing this, and you'll see it at your public library oftentimes, is a public library has a thing called the reconsideration form. And what this thing is a form you fill out in which case you want a book that is maybe to be reconsidered in the collection. And so you're asking and saying, I have issue with this book for X or Y reason, and I want to be reconsidered. Now, what the library then does is they will then go through their policy and evaluate the book, talk to their library board members or school board members, vote on this, and then determine if the book needs to stay or be removed from the collection. Now, what happens though is you can have things called informal challenges, and what happens with these is where someone doesn't fill out that form. There's been a lot of discussion around online about these groups like Moms for Liberty, for example, that are pushing for books to be removed from libraries and schools, and sometimes these happen through these more informal challenges where a person might get on social media and say, "You need to remove this book." Because it's inappropriate for X or Y reasons. And that kind of challenge is a little bit different because it doesn't follow the process, but the intention behind it is because you're coming at a school or library on social media, the kind of way it's being challenged would kind of scary library into removing it for one reason or another. And so I just want to give you a little bit of an outline as to why the differences between these two things, because a ban and a challenge are very different things, but a challenge essentially leads to a ban in some cases. Now, a question I get asked a lot as well is why do people challenge books? And there's a lot of different reasons, and I could talk for hours about just this question alone. But one of the reasons is that, especially in thinking about the books that are being challenged nowadays, and I'll pull up the data in a little bit for this, but a lot of it comes down to books that are upsetting the status quo as far as what is part of the canon of literature, what are considered the works that everyone should be reading. And that's one reason, but there's a lot of different ones. But looking at this, a lot of the challenges in the recent years, a lot of them focused around books by um, people of color, books from marginalized groups, and these challenges aimed at books that are promoting these particular groups or by these authors. And so you'll see challenges coming from groups based around that. But there's a lot of different challenges to take place. But just to give you a kind of broad answer to that question. Now, I want to point some data as well. So Banned Books Week, I don't have the updated graphic here, but these are some numbers from the American Library Association. So the American Library Association is a national group that tracks the number of challenges that happen per year. And so what happens is that libraries that experience book challenges or bans can report them to the American Library Association, so they can then document, okay, a book was banned or challenged in this state or this region. They can also see how many times a certain book was banned or challenged. Right now during Banned Books Week, there's some really great graphics up right now, and a list of the top 10 most challenged books. But I want to point to the data here I think that's really important. So, over the years, we've seen an increase in book challenges. So, starting in 2020, well, obviously the data goes before here, but looking at the 2020s, we have 273 in 2020, and this number has tripled and then doubled in some years as well. One thing I'll mention and that the American Library Association mentions as well, is that because of these informal challenges that are happening on social media, and also because of the current political climate, a lot of times what's happening is you have books that are being removed without being reported to the American Library Association. So these numbers here are a fraction, as this graphic says, of what's actually being challenged. So 4240 in 2023, for example, could be far higher than that. I think the American Library Association says that's maybe a small percentage of the actual number because it's kind of down to librarians or people in the communities reporting that these things are being removed. And in some cases, these things are not being reported or they're being removed before anyone can even notice that they're being removed. So, what's being done in response to these things? So, there's a lot of different things, and part we'll be talking about tonight is what people can do who aren't in communities where these book challenges are taking place, because I think it's an important piece of the puzzle in thinking about this. But a couple things are being done. The first is things that local libraries and communities are taking up initiatives around protecting banned books. For example, here. Book sanctuaries are one thing here, for example. This is in the Hoboken Public Library, New Jersey. This is an initiative they spearheaded, and essentially it's a display to promote banned books, but also saying this is a space in which if you want to engage with banned books, this is where you can do so. And so it's offering a space for people who want to learn more about banned books or read banned books. It gives them a space to do this. And what's great about these book sanctuaries is anyone can really start one of these. Any library or community can start essentially a banned book sanctuary. Now, beyond this, there's also a lot of legislation that's been pushed around book banning as well. Yep, I saw a thing in the chat as well. Montclair Public Library is a sanctuary library, which is fantastic. Besides, though, these book sanctuaries, there's been legislation pushed in a lot of states. Illinois, for example, where I got my degree, they passed legislation last year. Essentially, they call it the book ban, that essentially says that librarians have the ultimate authority and have been given the training necessary to be able to choose these books, and so therefore. Um, you cannot go through this process of banning them because we're trusting our librarians to have this authority. And so you have a lot of legislation being pushed for this. Now, I'll also mention, as far as what the landscape looks like right now, it's also very, very tense as well. Um, Let's see. I have one quick thing in the chat as well. I'm gonna be looking at the chat, but I'll try and answer questions as well at the end. Do the counts refer to number of books or number of challenges? So it refers to the number of, I believe, unique challenges. So when we go back to this graphic here, this is the number of unique challenges. But the number obviously goes up when you consider, okay, multiple challenges taking place across the country for one book. And what we'll see also is a lot of um, groups that are pushing for these challenges or these bans are sending out lists that are designed to be sent out en masse to multiple locations and saying, okay, we're going to send out the same email to 100 different libraries and see if any of them are willing to remove things from here. But thinking about the landscape right now, when it comes to book challenges and book bans, especially because we're in Banned Books Week right now, is obviously it's very, very tense right now. We have the data probably coming in the next couple of months for 2024 around book challenges in 2025. The thing that I've noticed, the research I've done is um, it's not just book challenges happening now, it's threats to library directors, threats to libraries saying we'll pull funding unless you remove these books, and that's changed things quite a bit. You'll also see a big thing that's come from this is just how tense these school board or library board meetings are. I was just sent a really great article about um, Wayne Township where things got really heated during a school board meeting over the content of a book. And Emily Knox, who is my advisor at University of Illinois and is a fantastic scholar on the subject, wrote a book called Book Bang in 21st Century America. And she talks about, she wrote this back in 2015, and she describes the book bang landscape at that time. And things have changed so much since then. But what she does focus in on, that was a really important part of my research, is this idea that school board and library board meetings where a book challenge takes place are really tense because you suddenly have all of these people around you who are community members, who are your neighbors, who could be friends or family. You are around them and suddenly seeing where they might differ from you in terms of their politics or their views on a particular challenge or band title. And so a lot of my research is looking at beyond this with the rise of social media because Dr. Knox wrote this book back in 2015. Social media has played such a large part in altering the landscape of how we think about book banning because you have these groups that are out there that are challenging books and organizing online. You also people are becoming more aware of book bans happening because of the press coverage for it, word of mouth on social media. And so I was really interested in looking at what happens when a book gets banned and when the story goes viral, if you will, and becomes national or international news? And what happens when you have a community, a small town where a book ban happens? What happens when you have all these people descending on who aren't from that community who want to talk about a book ban that's taken place, but maybe don't have the context around what that community is like? So I'm going to walk through some slides relating to my dissertation. So my dissertation is called Tweet of the Town, Synthesizing Local and Social Media Book Discourse. And so what I was really interested in looking at was, again, what happens when you have a book ban that takes place in a rural or small community, and what happens when you have people from outside that community come in who want to help, and what kind of disconnect is there? Because I think there's a lot of conversation to be had around if we have these things happening, how can we help communities that aren't ours that are experiencing book bans? We want to support them. Um, a lot of times, and I'll talk about this in my conclusion as well, we hear about reading banned books, engaging with banned books, but what else can we do besides that? So I'm going to walk through just a few things with some context around this community. So just to get a sense of people are familiar, you just put in the chat, has anyone heard of the graphic memoir Mouse? I see a couple of thumbs up in chat. Yep. A couple of folks. Awesome. Yeah. So this makes my job a little bit easier to explain this, but just for those who haven't heard of it before, it's a graphic memoir published in 1997, but it's a collection of comic strips written by Art Spiegelman describing his father's experiences as a victim of the Holocaust. And it's written as a graphic memoir, which means that it's a graphic novel, so it's written as sort of a comic book. And the intention behind this format, or one of the reasons why it's so popular, there's a lot of scholarship around why it's so popular, is that it's because it's a graphic novel, it's really accessible for students. So students can be reluctant readers sometimes. Sometimes it can be really difficult to get students to want to pick up a book and read, but a lot of scholarship says that graphic novels are a really great gateway into getting students interested in reading because you kind of have this fusion of text and images as well. And so because of that, also just because it's a really great story, Maus was regarded as one of the best pieces of Holocaust literature, or a popular one at least in schools. And so because of this, it made its way into the curriculum of McMinn County, Tennessee. And so I want to show here a headline talking from the Tennessee Holler about the removal of Mouse from the school district in Tennessee by the McMinn County School Board. So this happened back in January of 2022. Some of you may have heard about this. It made national news. It was on quite a few big major news publications, but I want to walk through um, what this looks like in just a second, but this drew my attention because we have here, as you saw in the earlier slide, the data points I had, there were so many different um, book ban challenges reported by the ALA every year, but here was one that got reported that became national news, and so I was really interested in seeing, okay, how does a book ban become national news, and then what are people saying about it who aren't from that community, and then how does that align or not align with what people are saying locally in the community? And so going back to my dissertation, the research objective for my dissertation was to explore the intersection of local and online discourse during a book ban. So what are people saying at the local level and on social media when a book ban happens? And so I was really interested in looking at that and what happens, what people are saying locally, but also people are saying on social media. And so we'll dive into that in just a second. But I want to walk through a couple things. First, I'm going to be saying discourse quite a bit. I define discourse as being communication between people that is done either verbally or through text. So, for example, if you talk to your neighbor verbally, that is discourse. If you post on social media and someone replies to that, that's discourse. If you send a text message, that's discourse. So, just to get that out of the way. So going back to Mouse, it found its way into McMinn County back in 2022. And McMinn County, for context, is in Tennessee. It is right down between Knoxville and Chattanooga and Nashville. And so it's right between these larger cities. And so it's considered a rural community. I believe the population was around 50,000 when I last checked. And so I want to walk through then a little timeline of events as far as how this happened, because I showed you the article saying that the book had gotten banned. So let's talk through this because I want to also emphasize too, how quickly this thing happened too. You had um, this story starting in January, and then by February it picked up steam quite quickly. So, on January 10th of 2022, the McMinn County School Boards calls an emergency meeting. And once I'm done with this, I can link the actual transcript if you want to read through that and see what people were saying on the school board about this. But the school board called an emergency meeting because someone had a concern over the content of Mouse. And so what was talked about this meeting was, well, there's inappropriate language and inappropriate imagery in this book. And so one of the things they gave as an example was, well, there's cursing. So if a student reads out loud a curse word in the bus, that is an endorsement from the school board that is okay to say these words in school. And so that was one of the reasons they justified to remove this from the curriculum. Now, originally, they suggested let's white out the images and the appropriate language. So essentially, let's take these things away, but still keep it in the curriculum. What ended up happening, though, was the school lawyer said essentially you can't do that because it's copyright infringement, which is its own conversation. But essentially, the school board then voted 10-0 to remove it from the curriculum. I'll also mention as well, this school board meeting was an emergency meeting. There was nothing publicized about it until after the school board meeting minutes went live. And so on January 26th, the school board meeting minutes went public, and so people had access and could see what was said during the meeting. And so that article I showed a little bit ago, the Tennessee Holler, showed Orbit a publication talking about what had happened. And so you have the people now knowing what happened at the school board meeting, and then within just a day, you have two things happening. One, the story goes viral. So you have the McMinn County School Board Twitter account at McMinn County Schools issuing a statement in response to the coverage of the ban. You also have stories like the New York Times and other national publications talking about the mouse ban. So within just a day of this these meetings being published, you have all these people talking about this thing. Um, so over the next week or so, you have all these people talking about these things. You have all these people tweeting at the school board account. I'll mention again at McMinn County Schools. Most school districts or libraries typically have some kind of social media presence, and so what I was really curious about was, well, on Twitter you can reply to or you can tweet at the account and say things to them. And so what were people saying about that? And we'll get into that in just a little bit. But on February 12th, then, you have a couple things happening. You have a press conference organized by residents of McMinn County who are opposed to the ban. And so these are people who had organized together who are all opposed to this ban and said, we need to find some way to change the narrative in our community that we're in favor of this thing and show that residents who care about this book and want to be back in the curriculum. Um, the same day, the school board has their first meeting since the ban happened. And they essentially double down and say that we're keeping Mouse out of the curriculum. One thing I'll mention as well is that they never mentioned um, what book replaced Mouse because there's a little bit of discussion by some of the school board members about potentially replacing with another book. They don't mention what it is. I think that's a really good, interesting point of discussion. We can definitely talk about later during Q&A. But that's our timeline. Going back to my objective again, I was really interested in looking at what happens when you have all these people online talking about this thing who aren't part of McMinn County, and then all these people at the local level talking about this thing. And so we're gonna talk about how I actually went about doing this study. And so I was really interested in seeing what were people saying at the local level versus what are people saying on social media about this thing. And so I got my data through two ways. One was through social media discourse, which is what people are saying online, and then local discourse, which is what were people in McMinn County, Tennessee saying about this ban when it happened. So I did two things. The first is I collected Twitter data around this book ban. So I wanted to see what are people saying about this book ban? What are they saying to each other? What are they saying to the school board? Things like that. And then with my local discourse, I went down to McMinn County and interviewed residents to see what did they think about being part of this community as a book ban took place. Because I think a lot of times when we see book bans, we see them kind of at a very bird's eye view level where we see that they've taken place. We see that there are school board meetings happening, but we don't necessarily hear from as many residents to hear what is it like being in a community in these spaces when this happens. And so when it ultimately came from this was I had 2,000 tweets collected on Twitter about the mouse ban and then 12 semi-structured interviews about the ban as well with residents who were living in the community at the time. I get asked this a lot whenever I do these presentations. If I talk to any of the school board members, I did not, and that's actually its own interesting conversation because um, obviously, with the research I do, it's pretty clear where I land on the side of the debate. But I was really interested in seeing what is the perspective of the people who were in favor of the ban and what was their perspective in seeing all these people who were saying things about them when this ban happened. And so I actually drove down to McMinn County last year when I was doing my interviews to try and talk to them, and I didn't get any interviews with the people. And I think a lot of that comes down to just the current state politically we're in right now, where it's very hard to kind of have these conversations or get people to open up and have these conversations. And so I sent out emails to people in McMinn County asking a couple of groups that were involved in the kind of protests against Mouse, asking them, well, can you talk about your experiences? I was really interested in hearing what you have to say about this. Here's an image of the school board. It was actually really surreal for me as well going down McMinn County because I'd heard at this point I had spent an entire year doing this research around this ban and I'd seen all this press coverage and heard all about this. And so like being able to walk into the school board meeting and see school board members there and to see this is where a major event had taken place in this community was a really interesting experience for me. Um, and so when I did my interviews with residents, I asked them a couple questions. The first thing was, what are your experiences with social media? Because I really wanted to know, okay, how do you engage with social media after seeing this whole thing with Mouse? The other thing, how do you think about censorship? How do you define it? And then really walk me through what it was like being part of a community when this happened. And then for my social media discourse, I looked at tweets online from January to August of that year when the book ban took place. And so I was really interested in seeing what were people saying about um, Mouse and the school board in particular. Because what was really fascinating to me was this at McMinn County Schools Twitter account because they had two tweets that were really, really popular. Most school district accounts typically get maybe one or two replies per post just because it's usually things that are specific to that school community. Like oh, there's a fall festival happening, or oh, there's a school closure because of weather. Um, but they had two posts in particular. One was their statement about the mouse ban, and the other one was a perhaps ill-timed post about School Board Member Appreciation Week, which was a lot of people who were very upset then replying to them. But I was really interested in seeing these particular tweets that were about these things. And so, going through these tweets and going through some of the analysis and some of the things I found, I'm going to give you some kind of important, some quotes and things I pulled out of what was being said online during this study. So again, going back to my objective, the primary objective again is to study the or explore the intersection of local and online discourse, what's happening in social media during a book ban. So going through these things, a couple themes I saw that came through this were the school, just this idea of being driven by good intentions. So these are a lot of people online who were not necessarily living in McMinn County, but had an interest in what was happening in McMinn County because of this ban that happened, because they were against these books that had been banned. And so there were three things that came out of this. One was the school board as a reflection of community. So what this means is the idea that the school board, because they are voted in by the community members, that means that they are therefore a perfect reflection of what the community values as well. Perceptions of communities through biased lenses. So thinking about what does it mean to be in a rural community in the South and have people who aren't from these communities view you from outside of these things and make judgments based on that. And then lastly, outsider action, promoting reading and access. Thinking about, well, with this interest from people outside of McMinn County, you had a lot of people who were really interested in reading about Mouse or giving people in McMinn County access to Mouse. So just to give you a sense of some of the things that were said by people, these school boards are a reflection of community. So these are some of the tweets I was seeing. Sanitizing the Holocaust is not okay. Unbelievable that at McMinn County Schools is afraid of a few naked mice. And at McMinn County Schools, great job making your students smarter. So this is the kind of discourse that was happening online, the things that the school board members were seeing on social media from people outside the community. And the South censoring mouse isn't surprising when you see who they're voting for. So a lot of things are targeting specifically the community of McMinn County, um, based on where they were located and based on these actions of the school board members. You're making your sure your students will remain stupid and uneducated. So lots of these really angry tweets, essentially critiquing or saying the school board was wrong for removing mouse from the curriculum. So this school board is a reflection of community. So this characterization of school board members as uneducated or Nazis, the perception that the McMinn County school board members' beliefs were shared by those living in McMinn County. And when I talk through some of the interviews with residents, a lot of them talk about this idea that, well, the school board members voted this way, but I don't agree with what they're saying. And it was really frustrating seeing the school board's views not aligning with what I have to say as a resident in this community. So going through some more tweets then, we have at McMinn County Schools, you're a bunch of uneducated Nazis. The mouse ban shows just how uneducated and stupid the South is. So these ideas of perceptions of communities through biased lenses and the idea that the South is politically monolithic. And then Twitter users comment based on their knowledge of the area. So they're thinking about and they're seeing, oh, a book ban happened and the book ban happened in the South. So therefore, because of my kind of perceptions of what the South is like, I'm going to make these judgments based on that. And then will they stay as conservative as Tennessee? It's no surprise they banned Mouse. Um, and then lastly, this other theme that emerged was promoting reading and access. And so what this means is tangible actions from outsiders in social media. So a couple things I saw from these tweets were one, petitions to get people to read Mouse, to get people or get the school board to reinstate Mouse. So there's a petition that I think got around 20 to 30,000 signatures online from people around the country who are like, we need the school board to reverse their decision and bring Mouse back into the curriculum. So that was one thing I saw. The other thing was people saying, well, I'm interested in reading Mouse now, or donating copies of Mouse. And so a couple quotes from here. Thanks for banning Mouse. I just went out and bought a copy. Um, Going back to this again, the idea of promoting people reading it. If anyone's living in McMinn County and wants a copy of the book and they banned you, send me a direct message and I'll mail you a copy. So I saw quite a few users saying, hey, I don't live in McMinn County, but if you want, I can send you a copy for free of this book. And I heard from several people there were copies sent over. Now, what happens when you kind of see how these things intersect? When you have this local discourse and this social media discourse coming together. So when you have a book ban that happens, what happens when you have these outsiders who have this perception of the book ban and these people who are in the community who are experiencing this book ban themselves firsthand? So three things here. I want to touch on two of them just for tonight for the sake of time. How outsider perceptions inform resident responses and community need versus perceived need. And this middle one here, community need versus perceived need, is so important because it really gets to the heart of when we think about Banned Books Week, when we talk about banned books, and we think about what do we do to prevent book bannings, but also support communities where these are taking place. Thinking about that middle theme. So how outsider perceptions inform resident responses. So we have a quote here from one of the residents I spoke to, Elliot, who says, I think there's a lot of well-meaning folks that jumped on this totally unnuanced bandwagon of look at those podunk racist McMinn County school board members. And what Elliot's talking about here is this idea that there were a lot of folks who really were opposed to this ban, who felt like this wasn't supposed to happen, but also at the same time, as he points out, immediately went on Twitter and started saying mean things to the school board members and not thinking necessarily, is this actually helping the situation? Is this going to get Mouse unbanned in the community? Another quote here, this is from another resident, it's not Elliot, I think I misattributed this here, but one of the residents, I asked him to talk about, well, what was it like being McMinn County when this happened? And he said, it was embarrassing, and that day, if you went to the Wikipedia page, there's a part where it was like, controversies in McMinn County, where it was at the day of. So I thought it was a little embarrassing that it was our community, which is a pretty quiet community. We don't really get involved in a lot of stuff, for something like that to happen, and without us knowing or for us having a say, it was infuriating and embarrassing to have that happen, and to be public news, not just a local thing. And what I think is so striking about this too is this idea that there's this narrative that developed about McMinn County and the community that was sort of out of control of the residents who are opposed to this ban happening. And the frustration that kind of came from seeing all of these people piling on your community and saying these things about it, coming from a place of caring about these things, but maybe not so doing it in the most productive way. Now, thinking about this was the school board meeting from February 12th. So this is the first meeting after the school board had their secret meeting. And you can see it's a packed house here. Actually, when I spoke to residents, they mentioned that this was actually there were two rooms beyond this one full of residents because there were so many people who showed up who wanted to talk about this thing, who cared about this thing as well. And it's hard to see in these images here, but if you see the gentleman speaking here, as well as a couple people at the front, they have on these stickers that I was told read McMinn County Neighbors, and McMinn County Neighbors is an organization that was formed in response to the book ban and in response to that and saying, we need to find a way to change the narrative that everyone in Tennessee or in McMinn County thinks the same way about this book ban, and we want the book to get reinstated, and we also want to change the perception that everyone in our community is in agreement with this ban taking place. And so I asked the resident to talk about who was here at the meeting, talk about like what was it like seeing all these people show up for this, because this was the most attended school board meeting they'd ever seen. And Oakley mentions that to go and see so many people there was really amazing. I was proud in that. I was frustrated by the decision that was ultimately made, and she's talking about the decision to keep Mouse out of the curriculum. But like the fact that the community showed up and then a lot of them were on our side, you don't think that a lot of people on your side, and a lot of them were. A couple of residents I spoke to said it was just this really empowering moment in seeing that they weren't the only person in the community who had these particular views or perceptions about the book ban being opposed to it, and it felt like there was a space for them to come together. And I'll mention too, McMinn County Neighbors is still operating to this day beyond the scope of just talking about book bans. They're now focused on public education within McMinn County within Tennessee and advocating for that. Now, I want to get to the second theme here, which is community need versus perceived need. And when I say community need, I'm talking about the idea of what does the community need where a book ban takes place versus what is the perceived need. So if you're looking at this from the outside, what do you think is needed in these communities? So when I talked to Gray, who is a community leader in McMinn County, she said there's care and support and funding and books flowing in from all over the country, but in a way that didn't always honor the community that is present. I think some of that is well-intentioned and some is kind of patronizing, as if there's no one who cares about these things in this community here. And I thought that was such a great quote to highlight, because what Gray's getting at here is that, yeah, it was really nice seeing people who cared intensely about this thing, because there is something really special about seeing those outside your community who care coming in with donations and finding ways to support. But also there's a level of frustration among the community members feeling like, well, these are coming from a place of, well, we're going to try and fix this because the residents don't know what they're doing. And a lot of the residents who I spoke to said, well, it was frustrating seeing that because it felt like we were still trying to do all this work, but it wasn't necessarily aligned with what people were doing outside the community. Now, I mentioned I traveled to McMinn County last year to do my interviews with residents. As part of this, I traveled to E.G. Fisher Public Library, which is the McMinn County library in the area. But anyway, so I went to the public library and wanted to see, okay, they had I heard about all these copies of Mouse being donated. And so I was curious. I wanted to see, okay, what happened to these? And these were the copies on the shelves. Now I talked to someone who was who was in the community, was affiliated with the library. And she mentioned, well, the library got like 70 copies of Mouse, but didn't know what to do with them because they can't put that many copies on the shelves. A lot of the teachers got copies of them, apparently didn't know what to do with them. And so there was this sense that, well, it's nice that they're sending these copies over, but to what end? Is this changing the school board members' minds? Is this making McMinn County a better place because of this? Um, and so Gray mentions this, and she says, before you start shipping me copies of Mouse, thank you for your heart. Can I give you maybe some better feedback from this community and what we know our kids need? My values and yours are aligned, but I need you to trust that the people in our community know what we need. I think this is such a great line because she's talking about this idea that there's a lot of care coming from outside these communities, from people on the East Coast and the West Coast and all these different communities that care so much about um, intellectual freedom, about fighting censorship and sending these copies of Mouse in, but in the process, maybe ignoring the work that's being done already or what's actually needed. So one of the things that Gray talked about is this idea that, well, this happened because of things like gerrymandering. This happened because of things that are happening within these states at the political level that need to be addressed or discussed and highlighted by outsiders. And so thinking about that, I think was really important. I think that a lot of residents really emphasized. And then I'll just talk through this because I think it is worth mentioning too, since we have a little bit of time here. One thing that's always interesting to me too is that there aren't actually any young people at this school board meeting. If you look through here, there is not a single student in the room. I asked around, there were some students who were involved in the press conference beforehand, but none of them spoke at the actual press conference. And I think part of that comes down to it's really scary as a young person to come into these school board meetings, because I'm sure when you were younger, if you were in school, it was really public speaking was really scary. I know when I was in high school, public speaking was terrifying. Public speaking is probably 10 times more terrifying when you're a room full of adults who maybe don't necessarily agree with what you have to say. And so part of my research for this project is also looking at the role of young people in book bans. And one of the quotes I got from one of the adults who was present said, it takes a really exceptional 16 or 17-year-old to feel like they deserve the right to have an opinion when mom and dad are fighting. And what this really means is this idea that, well, when the adults are like having this discussion, even though like they're part of this conversation too, because they're the ones most affected by it, it can be really hard and take a teenager who's really, really adamant about being part of this conversation. And that can be really hard to learn or take on when you're just 16 or 17 years old. And then one thing here is a quote from Reagan, who's actually a student in McMinn County when this happened. And she's talking about how one of the things that I think was really fascinating was when I think about how young people get involved in what's happening with these book bans, she talked about posting on social media, and she talks about here this idea that, well, when I was on social media, she felt like I've got my own kind of screen I can hide behind where I can kind of have this space where I can talk about this book ban in a way that doesn't feel like I'm at risk of getting in trouble. Because she talks about later, I would have gone to the meeting, but I was scared of potentially the people who are handing me my diploma as a student being the ones who are present at this meeting. I didn't want to speak out against them because I didn't want to get in trouble. And I think that's a thing that's very real for a lot of students entering the space. So going to some kind of early conclusions here. Again, I'll reiterate the objective just because I think it's important. Primary research objective here is again to explore the intersection of local and online discourse during the book ban. Now, as part of this, I put forth a model for evaluating this, but for the sake of time, I'm going to skip through that. Going through this really quickly. So some implications here that I think are really important to talk about is when it comes to aligning outsiders with community needs, outsiders must take the time to learn about the communities they wish to engage with. So when a book ban happens, it's really important that people are one engaging these things, but also thinking about what is being done at the local level with these communities, and is there things that you can do to help them that is respectful and honors what the community members who are fighting for these things want. And then also other things I'll touch on here, the importance of community engagement for library professionals. One of the things I talk about with my library science students a lot is how important your community is. And as community members yourselves, showing up for your library and showing the value of it, because I think one of those important things for these things when book bans take place is showing up in your community for your library or other libraries and showing why these spaces matter for your communities, because they bring so much besides books. They bring internet access, they bring access to learning through things like maker spaces. And so there's so much to accomplish with them. And I think community members showing up for these things is important. A few more things here. Yeah, so some what conclusions of this project though are social media provides a unique environment for discourse and engagement in which outsiders might learn about book bans that have taken place and choose to engage in my new term, localized social media intervention. And in essence, that social media has changed the way we think about book bans, because when a book ban took place in the past, you didn't have all these people talking about it online. You had people who were talking in these communities that were very local and very specific to their community. When you have social media, you now have people coming outside these places to issue challenges in some cases, but also people talking about these things who aren't part of these communities but care intensely about these things. With Banned Books Week, for example, you have that happening. And that gets to my last point then, with the idea that outsiders can come into these spaces with good intentions, but engage in ways that are not always aligned with the community. So thinking really about how to align with what the community members need in these spaces. I get asked a lot as we close out here, before we jump into Q&A, what to do in response to book bans that are taking place. One thing is, as always, read banned books. There are like countless lists identifying books that have been challenged. Read those. In particular, definitely read books that are banned from marginalized authors or authors from smaller publishers. A lot of times what I've found happens is, with the case of Maus, that's already a really well-known novel. For lesser known novels that get banned or books that get banned, this can be devastating for the author because it might be their first publication, and when it gets banned, it can be incredibly hard on those authors. So looking into those things, for example. But beyond that, just show up for your libraries. Because I think we've moved past just reading banned books, but also thinking about how can we show up for our libraries and support them? How can we think about promoting book sanctuaries and also supporting legislation across the country that protects libraries and protects libraries from book challenges that take place. So thank you all so much. I'm going to open my time to questions and just a conversation around this, but this has been fantastic.
Can I make a comment?
Yes.
Okay. I actually teach classes on banned books, and I teach them to senior citizens like 55 and older. And one of the things that's been kind of interesting is when we read banned books, and they're usually children's books that have been banned in school districts, some of the comments are that the books are inappropriate for the ages that they're taught for. And I happen to agree with that assessment after reading some of the books. I'll just give one example. Maya Angelou's book, I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings. Several people said, you know, that book might be traumatic for somebody who's been sexually assaulted as an 8-year-old, which is what Maya was. Or my child was sexually assaulted. I didn't think it was appropriate for an 8th grader or a 7th grader. So I was wondering if with Maus, did they ban it just for 8th graders, or was it allowed to be in the curriculum for high school kids?
That's a great question. I think it comes aligns to the question in the chat as well about no mention of the grade or age level. Yeah, so Maus was a target for the 8th grade students for their Holocaust unit. and they took it out of that specifically. I think the issue people had primarily was not just that it was removed, but because there was no real process or transparency with the process. Because the school policy that a lot of the people who spoke out against this said was, well, you have a process when you remove these things. There need to be some kind of review involving
Right,
teachers or librarians or professionals who have experience working with this material, so we can talk through, okay, if we're going to remove this or change this in some way, how can we do it in a way that, one, make sure we're keeping the content intact, um, and also making sure that it is, again, appropriate for students. The thing I was really curious about too is, I think, and a lot of residents also mentioned, is what got lost in the conversation too was a lot of people were immediately jumped to the conclusion that, well, the school board members were anti-Semitic because they removed the book. And I can't say one way or another because I didn't interview them, have a chance to talk to them, so there's no way of knowing specifically what their intentions were. But that was one of the things that people kept saying. But that might not have been the case. And a lot of the residents I spoke to said as much, said, well, it might not have been that, but it was still problematic. They removed it because of the process. And that's, I think, what it comes back to a
right,
lot of time too, is there needs to be a process in place at the end of the day, regardless of it, where there is a review process for that involves educators, involves parents, involves all parties. That way that people are able to see, and also there's transparency as well. Because I think the thing that people were also upset about was there wasn't transparency when this happened. It was a secret meeting, and before people knew it, this had already been removed. And to my knowledge, I don't know whatever replaced it in the curriculum as well.
So,
Someone else is saying the same thing, kind of as Emily in the chat. She's saying it's dash 20.
Mhm.
Did I miss something? Why is there no mention of grade or age level? The same book might be banned for one age group and be acceptable for others,
right.
PG versus R for movies. Was that you, Emily?
What? No, that wasn't me, but yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah, and again, that comes back to, again, policy, like what is in place and like what is being enforced then. And also, is the school board or district following these policies then? And when I teach students too, I mentioned too, like with these things, you have to have a policy in place for reconsideration or for whatever system you have for determining what books go in the collections or what things go in the curriculum then.
Yeah, there's a
Um,
hand up.
yeah, Joanna, I think I see your hand up.
yeah, okay. So, on the one hand, this was a very localized, and you needed that for a PhD thesis,
Mhm.
but we are hearing that in Florida, they don't want to teach anything about slavery, that it even happened. So these huge things that are going
Mhm.
on, it's almost too much to comprehend. But I guess my question is there anything in your overall research, everything you've done, that shows methods of getting books unbanned?
That's a great question. I think the big thing is going to come down to just community support and having enough community members to show and justify why this is. I think a lot of it also is making sure you're voting in school board members and voting in local elections. I think it's the case for pretty much anything that's happening at the local level because these are hyper local things. Obviously, you do these state legislation things, which in which case make sure you're voting your state elections as well. But so many things are informed by this, and I think like with McMinn County, I think there are a lot of residents who were frustrated with what happened because I think a librarian actually ran for school board after that happened, and then was not voted in, unfortunately. And so it is a difficult space to be in. I don't necessarily have a good answer either. A one size fits kind of fits all because these are unique things for every community where you may have community members who are willing to show up for these things, but then it can be also really hard communities where there isn't necessarily as much support, where you do feel like you're the one person who's speaking out against these things.
And even hearing about it, you know.
Yeah, and like the social media part is really important too because it is getting the word out about these things. So people are more aware of them happening. But yeah, it's really difficult because you do like the example you gave of Florida or Texas. These are like larger level legislation pieces that are making it so these things aren't being allowed to be taught, or at least are scaring educators into positions where they feel like I'm not even going to bother addressing this particular subject because I don't want to deal with the potential consequences if I mess this up, because I know Texas has a House bill they put in place that has the same thing for curriculum.
Um, One thing that I think is interesting is that um, so I'm running a book club tomorrow, also for Banned Books Weeks,
Hmm.
which is there might be like one place for one person, but so people are very interested in it. And I'm running it about 1984, which is one of the most frequently banned books. So when I looked into it, I was like, well, I mean, like I understood that 1984 was banned behind the Iron Curtain. And apparently, you could be arrested simply for owning it in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, the former Czechoslovakia, the former Yugoslavia, Romania, etc. Um, and it was such an important book that the CIA actually translated it into those languages and disseminated it, made it available to people. But then I was like, well, is it really banned here in the United States? And it is banned here in the United States. And I just wonder if anyone here can guess why it's banned. Anybody want to guess? No?
Well, I'll tell you more tomorrow.
Because is it the sex scene in it?
It is.
Yeah, I teach enough banned books to know.
Well, I mean, to me, the sex scene is so tame and so trivial in comparison to the violence. Like if I were concerned about my child reading it, and as a mom, my daughter read To Kill a Mockingbird in like 7th grade or something. And I really thought, or sixth, it might have even been 6th grade. I really thought that the themes were too mature for her. So what I did was I listened to it on audiobook with her and we talked about it. And I think that's a good way for parents to handle those kinds of concerns rather than banning it. Or you could say, I don't want my child to read it, but why does everybody else's kid have to stop reading it? But in general, if that book had been assigned to my daughter in 8th grade or something, I wouldn't have been as concerned about the sex as I would have been about the violence and the hatred.
I think that's a great point as well, too, about the idea of like individual student versus like a more broad, like we're addressing this as part of the curriculum because of one parent's concern. Because I think there is a lot of discussion around, okay, like, well, a parent might want this removed, but does that reflect the entire community in some cases? I'll also mention too, when I spoke to some of the people in McMinn County about the mouse ban, one of them mentioned, she was a parent, she was more concerned about social media than the books because she said, the thing I'm more scared about is what my like daughter or son can see on TikTok and what she can pull up on her phone versus what anything that's in books or just on the internet. So I think that was an interesting point as well
But it's
around.
also alarming that you couldn't find out what they had replaced it with, so that these children may not be learning about the Holocaust at all.
Yeah,
And this is a Holocaust unit, so,
absolutely. Yeah. And like I have some hypotheses as like what it could have been. I think what would have been interesting, one book that has been put forward when I've talked to a couple people about it is The Boy in Striped Pajamas as a alternative because people view it as being a much more like Baudelaireized or sanitized version of the Holocaust. And so that might have been what was put forward. I need to still reach out at some point and see if they have anything. When I did all my interviews, I asked people like, do you know what it was that got replaced with it? Because I think a lot of this too, thinking of like, okay, what was the community response and what was the larger response? I think if the school district really was adamant about like teaching the Holocaust, they could have put out a statement saying, we believe in this. We just feel like this is a book. This is not the right book for this. We're going to be replacing it with this book for X or Y reasons, which still would have gotten a lot of pushback, but I think is maybe a different way of doing it than just giving a very vague statement saying we're not keeping the curriculum.
I mean, I just wonder, like, it just seems to me so often when I read about book bans, it's about sex. And why is everybody so worried about sex? Why is sex so much scarier to so many parents than violence or, racism or, I don't know, all these other,
authoritarianism.
yeah,
Yeah.
all these other topics, which to me as a parent were more concerning.
Well, I find it interesting that a lot of people that object don't have any problems taking or letting their kids see movies that have sex in it. And to me, it's
And violence.
that to me, well, violence, but a lot of people don't like Ariel said, a lot of people don't object to the violence that's in the book, so they object to the sex. So people will take their kids to see violent movies when they're 6 or 7 years old. And I know people that take their Christians who object to these books will take their kids to see a sex scene a movie that has a sex scene. To me, it's just mind-boggling because something that's visual seems to be much more impactful than reading something in a book that if you don't understand, you're going to kind of skip over it. I mean, I read stuff when I was younger as a child, and it was like the parts I didn't understand, I just kind of like skipped over it. So it's talking about Florida. A
Yeah.
lot of people in Florida are actually taking the banned books and putting them in like free libraries.
Mm.
So people in Florida are fighting back, but they'll buy the books or people send them the books and they'll put them in little free libraries. And so that the kids have access to them.
There's
I
a
think it's a very cute
wonderful
idea.
novel actually I just picked up in a bookstore. I need to finish reading because I'm doing it for, well, part research, part for pleasure. But I believe it's a little Lua Dean's Little Free Library of Banned Books, and it's I think a fiction story about someone who does that in the community and kind of the fallout implications of that. So I think that's a thing I need to at some point finish reading because I think it's a great idea for a book. I'll mention too, and this is definitely a little bit outside my depth of my research area, but I think like going back to your question of like, okay, movies versus books, I think there's some, and I've thought about this a lot because I think one thing that's fascinating is this idea of the book as an object. Like, what is makes that different, and also the context of where it exists in, because the book is being taught in schools or it's in a space of learning, and I think that influences a lot around like why there's opposition. This idea that I guess that views movies as not things that you learn from, but a book being a thing that you learn from.
Especially if you're discussing it in a class situation, you mean?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but
that's
that
just a
Probably be a good
potential
idea.
theory,
but
but
that could
like,
be better because it could contextualize it
mhm.
and point out what the main points of the book are, which is not the sex scene in most cases, you know.
Yeah,
So
but a lot of parents object to somebody else teaching their children about sex.
right, so they might not even talk about but
Yeah,
whatever.
you know,
Question.
a fascinating subject.
I have a question for you, Andrew. Um, and I'm sorry I'm inserting myself, but I hope that
Oh, no problem.
my contributions are valuable. But um, I always wondered, like, do the kids then get very curious and interested in the book? Like, what is
Mhm.
the effect on the children? Because I was always somebody who, I was a bit rebellious. So if you had banned a book, it would have made me much more interested in the book. And do you think that that ever happens with the kids, or do you know about that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. When I spoke to the student who was in McMinn County during the mouse ban, she mentioned, yeah, I immediately went home and like wanted to read it. I like asked my parents to order me a copy of it off Amazon, or like a couple of her classmates apparently got books from people on Twitter who are offering free copies. And so yeah, and there's sales data as well. So mouse sales spiked, I think 200%, I think, the week after the ban happened because so many people were out there buying copies of it to read. And so there is kind of this unintentional effect then of like, yeah, there's more interest because people now are like, well, especially students are like, well, why can't I read this? Like, what is this? And I'm sure, like in my case, in my students, I'm sure some of them went back if they hadn't read Always Running, they probably were very curious then as to like why it wasn't the curriculum. Or I remember actually a student asked me actually with Beloved, they said, Mr. Zalat, why is there a copy Beloved here? Like, why aren't we reading it? And I had to like figure out a reason to explain like why it wasn't allowed. And they were really curious as to like why it wasn't in the curriculum because they're like, it's on the shelves. And so I think I'm a huge advocate for I think youth voices this idea. I don't think we give young people enough credit either in being able to think critically or be curious about these things as well. So that's a kind of very long-winded question. Um, I saw a question from Joanna as well. Which banned books list would you recommend we look for? So I'm gonna link here. This is the ALA's top 10 most challenged books. This is the based on the data they get every year. I'll pull some other ones as well to link those.
The ALA has a listing of the top 100 books banned in each decade, and that's where I
Hmm.
get my books from. Because you can take a large selection and you have like you have 100 to choose from. But with the ALA, the last couple of years, all the books are LGBTQ books. And so you don't get a wide variety of books that are banned when you look at the
Well,
ALA.
I would say that is, but partially also just because of what's being challenged now too, because we've seen a larger shift in LGBTQ plus books as well. And so, like a couple of years ago, I think like, Absolute True Diver Part-Time Indian was the most banned book, and the subject matter that's far different from what's being challenged right now, because All Boys Are Blue is the most banned book this year, and so you can see a shift, and a lot of this built is
Yeah.
based around what people, what challenges are targeting as well, and so that's even its own thing because even the banned books class I took back in 2016, I think the books we read were so different from what we're seeing now because it was things like The Golden Compass, The Outsiders, um,
Yeah.
Catcher in the Rye, which things are very different content-wise, which is important to read through these, but I think also important to understand too the contextual shift in between them. I'm also going to link too because I think it's worth linking the school board meeting minutes from McMinn County because I think it's a good read if you want to see kind of what was being said at this meeting by school board members. Let me see if I can pull those up. Yeah, I have the transcript right here. It's a really fascinating read because you do see like there's two or three school board members who are very, very adamant about taking these out of the curriculum. You kind of see the rationale they go through. It's also interesting seeing too how quickly they move then to remove the book outright. Um, but yeah, these are fantastic questions. This is a great conversation we're having as well.
Actually, we read last night at the Telegraph Club by Melinda Lowe in an adult book group, in my adult book group.
You read what?
I'm looking, this is one of the Penn most banned books, most frequently banned or challenged books.
What was the name of the book?
It's called Last Night at the Telegraph Club, and it's a
Oh,
historical novel about the coming of age of a young girl, a young girl of Chinese descent in San Francisco, around and during the McCarthy era.
mm.
Remember that one, Jelana?
I think I was away for that one. So, and
So
I had like too much
some
going
really
on.
good books
I'll
on
have to
this
pick it
list.
up. Yeah.
Like the number one book on this list is Clockwork Orange. I guess that must be more about violence than sex, I would think. But who knows? Maybe it's just the sex and stomping on people's faces is just fine. Who knows?
Well, it's pretty kinky sex.
I mean, I read Shiloh, and that's a children's book. Shiloh was banned or challenged in several places because of what animal abuse, is what they said, and the fact that the child was disrespectful and lied to his parents. And those are some of the reasons for young children's books being banned and challenged in school.
Mhm.
So, and Shiloh was a great book.
My rabbi did a whole thing about, this book talks about this and this book talks about that and this, and he goes, "What book is this?" And we all went, "The Bible." So yeah, you can find all that stuff in the Bible. So you could ban that. But,
I guess here's a question for you, Andrew. Is it ever legitimate to ban a book I mean, like, I guess that's kind of what Emily and the other person who was
Mhm.
DAJ 20 were asking. Is it ever a legitimate action to ban a book?
That's a difficult question, but it's an important one. I think also because when I teach library science students too, like we have this conversation around like when is it appropriate? I think it comes down to again, like I'll defer back to policy again. I think it comes to do with is the policy in place? Is there a policy in place for this? Has this gone through the necessary review? And what is being done in response to the policy review? And I think a lot of times too, with the thinking about even the legislation in Illinois, the anti-book bans list or anti-book ban legislation, it does become a question then of, oh, well, what happens if there is a problematic book that's in libraries there? What happens then? Um, because a lot of conversations I've had to people ask is, well, what about things like Mein Kampf, for example, in libraries, like where a lot of it comes down to also where is the book placed as well? Like what is the context of the book? Like are these books that are in displays, for example? Are these books that are being used for particular things? Are these in high circulation areas of the library, for example? So it's a really complex answer. I think I just go back to saying again, like it depends. A lot of it is based on policy, but it's also based on whatever the community thinks, because these are all going to be things that are going to be hyper specific to the community that you're operating in as a librarian or that you're living in as well.
Fair.
So a lot of the banning books now are not attacking schools. A lot of them are attacking actually libraries.
Hmm.
Glen Ridge had that happen in their library just a couple of years ago, and it's not just in New Jersey. I mean, New Jersey's had like 4 or 5 different libraries being attacked. How do you know that the librarians themselves are not self-censoring?
It's hard to know because you don't if you because again because a lot of the data is self-reported, it's hard to know in a lot of cases. And when I spoke to one of the projects I was on last year, was talking about we did interviews with a lot of library directors across the country who'd experienced challenges using some of the Pen America data, and someone talked about yeah, like it's a tough decision. Like will neither endorse or not endorse this, but like libraries have talked about, yeah, like I'm in a tough position because it's do I take this book out of circulation and keep my job and make sure that we have a librarian who can kind of live to see another day, or do I fight this? And I think that's an interesting kind of ethical question. And I think when I teach my library students, I say, well, it's a decision you have to make then because sometimes you might be in a situation where, hey, this is your livelihood, this is how you put food on the table for your family, and so you may choose to do this because it means you can keep your job. It means that your library can have someone who's going to keep advocating for you. Because I had one director I spoke to who talked about that a lot. But yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. It's a very long-winded kind of response to it.
I think it's a tough question. I mean, I think it's like a lot of situations where you have to make compromises that you might not, relish.
Hmm.
When we had the discussion at the Montclair Book Festival with Penn and others about the Glen Ridge, one woman stood up and said, you may not want your child to read this, but I'm an adult who lives in the community, and you can't prevent me from getting this out of my library where I pay taxes. So that was an interesting response, I thought.
That's been a thing I've seen a lot in rhetoric around book challenges too. Is this like is not even about the books anymore or about the consequence of not taking the books. They have is rhetoric that's focused around either removing people from their positions or federal funding or funding for these libraries and saying I will get your funding removed from these spaces.
Right.
And so that's I think the new kind of issue within library science and talking about library science and within talking about banned books and how we think about um what libraries are doing because it is a thing that even when I did my interviews in McMinn County, I went to the public library there and I found that the director had been forced to step down a couple
Wow.
weeks before over a book display they had up. And so that's like its own thing of because of this display, it wasn't even the books that were removed, it was now the directors removed and replaced by someone different with different views.
What was the display?
It was a pride display.
Oh, yeah, that's the big thing right now.
Well, um, does anybody else have any other questions? Or I don't want you to feel that we have to remain if the conversation reaches its natural end.
Yeah, and I'll say again, y'all have been fantastic as well, and just asked some really important questions too, because these are things that like I'm continually thinking about and trying to figure out better ways to address these things and help other people learn more about how to address these things as well, because this, unfortunately, too, the landscape changes by the day too, and so things are gonna be changing. How we think about how we teach these things to our library science students, the ones I work with, or how libraries in these communities go about responding to these things or supporting other communities. So again, some really great conversation happening tonight.
Have you heard about the girls, the high school girls in Texas that are having like a banned book club? So they meet actually, I think, in the school library and they read banned books. It started by girls, but there are a couple of guys in it. Um, and they're actually the school's allowing them to do it, but I don't know for how long. It's in
No, I'll have to take
Texas.
a look at that. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
there's a video on it online.
mhm. Yeah, I'll have to take a look at that because yeah, like one of the things I'm really fascinated with is again like how do young people think about these things because they're clearly like the ones who are most affected by it at the end of the day. They're the ones who have access to or don't have access to these things. So how are they responding to it? And again, like it's funny too because with like the case I looked at, the student I talked to said, yeah, all my friends and I we read the book and then we were talking about it during lunchtime. We kept talking about it like outside of it, and so it's like a like pseudo banned book club in a way, or just this conversation is happening outside of classrooms.
I just wanted to ask if everybody is aware of that New Jersey has a new freedom to read law.
Did that pass?
Yes,
Mhm.
governor
did it
signed it
pass?
in, the governor signed it into law.
When?
The governor signed it, I believe, in December.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
I knew that it was going through, but I didn't know if it ever actually was going to be successful.
Yes, and it says that they are, all boards of education and governing boards of public libraries are prevented from censoring library material based on a disagreement with a viewpoint, idea, or concept, or solely because an individual finds certain content offensive, unless they are restricting access to developmentally inappropriate material for certain age groups, which is what you were talking about,
Right.
Emily.
Yeah.
And the law requires all of the organizations to come up with a review process.
Yeah, I teach Zoom classes in the University of Delaware, and when I was teaching my last banned book class, I asked the students to find out what their local library policy is for banned books, and they came back and says, "Oh, we don't ban books in Delaware." And I go, "What do you mean? They ban books in every state." What they do in Delaware for the libraries, not for the school libraries, is they have this formula of all the libraries. If somebody comes in and questions a book, they have to fill out a form, and it includes things like, have you read the book? What parts of you find objectionable? And then the local library sends it to a state librarian organization, and they make the decision. So the onus is taken off of the local library and is put onto the state. So I thought that was really interesting. And generally the state picks up the books. So there's certain things that states can do to actually help not banning books in the local libraries.
Yeah. I think the point too about it going to the state library and also is interesting because it does, like to your point, take a lot of the kind of like stress off of the local spaces. Because I think when I did my interviews with these library directors, they said, yeah, it's an emotionally hard process because
Right.
Yes.
you're having to be, you are a public figure in your community to some extent as a library director, and it can be difficult on you, on your staff members, on everyone involved. And so I think by being able to defer it up the chain to the state library, then you're allowing for kind of that space that I think which is really, really great. So yeah, I hadn't heard about that.
Now, do you have any research, Andrew, on how often these challenges are made by people who haven't even read the books?
That's a
Most.
hard one, because it's also, I think that's also contingent on them then saying, admitting
They're
that
going
they
to
haven't read
admit
that.
that?
Because I think that's the difficult part too, is I know in Dr. Knox's book, she actually mentioned she interviewed someone and they said they hadn't read it, but I think you'd be hard pressed to get people who would be willing to answer that honestly. So I think it'd be difficult to gauge that. But that is a thing that comes up a lot, is this idea of, well, and with these reconsideration forms saying, okay, have you read it? And then can you identify the objectionable parts? So I think there's a level of like, what I've seen from a library directors too is because if you set the policy forms in such a way that they're able to they have to go through a number of hoops or at least need to prove that they've engaged with this book and can prove like why they object to it. Sometimes they'll just, people will just give up and just not even go through with the challenge.
Because I'm thinking of things like Ulysses, where nobody had read it. They just heard
Mhm.
about it, and then it was banned all over the place,
And
so
that's the reason why people read it today. If it had never been banned, nobody would read it.
that's not
But it's
why.
an awful book.
That's not why, and it's not an awful book.
My opinion.
I think this is one of those subjective matters.
So, Andrew, are you still studying this question about banned books?
Oh yeah, it's well, as a newly minted PhD, I think that's gonna be my life from now on, is looking at this. I think one of the things when I defended actually recently was I want to look at the long-term effects across different sites because I think McMinn County is just a piece of the puzzle in thinking about, because one thing I'm really curious about is, well, once a book banning happens or doesn't happen, it gets reinstated or not reinstated, what happens in those communities after the fact? Because a lot of times you'll see press coverage saying, oh, a book got banned in this state, in this city or county, and that's kind of the end of it. But there's a really great quote from one of the residents I talked to where she said, "Hey, I still have to live here." Like she told one of the New York
Right.
Times reporters and said, "Hey, you can write your story and leave. I still have to live here in McMinn County. These are people I live next to and are going to continue to live next to for years." And I think one thing I'm really interested in looking at then is like, what are the long-term implications of this then? Are there more challenges that are happening because of this? Are there, with McMinn County in particular, what was interesting to me was the group that came out of it, because there was not a community organizing group around public education rights for students until this happened. And so
Sure.
now you have this thing, and like that was kind of the silver lining. A lot of residents said for this whole thing was, well, obviously it was really upsetting the book was still on the curriculum, but also we are now holding the school board accountable for everything. Like one of them
Mhm.
told me, we send two members to every school board meeting every month now, so that way they know they can't get away with just having secret meetings or they can't just do things without us noticing. And so like when I talked to some of them, they said the current thing we're looking at was public school or charter school vouchers and advocating against those in favor of public school funding.
Mhm.
And so very far from book banning, but still tied to a thing that is very local to them, but also important, but also a thing that might be not wasn't happening until you had this event that kind of united the community, or at least members of the community. And so I'm really curious
Right.
to see like um, cases where maybe it doesn't get as much social media traction, where maybe it's just reported in the local paper. What happens in that case is, do you think are things different? Because there's so many cases to work with. So the project for the next year or so is gonna be looking at that. Also looking at other social media platforms. I just looked at Twitter. I think TikTok is a really interesting platform because that's definitely more youth focused, and I want to see how are young people engaging on there. Are they having conversations about these things?
There's a really good, did you see the movie? Well, they just showed a movie here in Montclair at the Claridge called The Librarian.
I haven't seen it yet, but I've heard of it.
And I did see it and it was fabulous. And they also had one of the librarians from Hunterdon County at the movie
Oh,
talking about her experience. The movie's being shown again right now in New York City at the Film Forum, if anybody is interested. But in the movie, they do quite a cross section of the country. Like a lot of people just think the outrageous book bans happen in Florida and Texas, but the movie shows that it's other places, including New Jersey.
Jersey. That librarian in Hunterdon County, she really went through
She
hell.
did.
Really, really. I haven't seen
Well,
her in
she
person.
received death threats.
She
Mhm.
received
She
death threats.
even had threats when she came to the Claridge here in Montclair.
You're kidding.
No,
Wow.
they had to have security.
That's terrible.
And and that's like when I did my interviews with the directors at these different spaces, like some of them, I asked like, oh, have you had staff members who are like reluctant to come on? Because volunteers might feel like, oh, if there's a challenge that happens at my library, I don't know if I want to come and volunteer if someone's gonna come in and like harass me or share my info online. I know one director I spoke to like had the same thing happen to her. She had her address shared, and she's
Right.
also like, it's difficult even after this thing has taken place because she was like, I still have to go to like my grocery store and people know who I am.
Mhm.
And so that's like on the library side of things, like it's a difficult experience.
Right. Well, I'm glad that you're still studying it. It's a big issue. Affects
So
all of us.
And an
So-
important one. And we found Andrew through his thesis advisor. First, I found the book about the banned books by Emily Knox, and then Emily said, "Well, I can't do it, but I have this fabulous a recent PhD student whose thesis I oversaw." And Andrew, I thought you just did a wonderful job. Thank you so much, and thanks for all of us. And when we get we're gonna the uh post this recording on YouTube on our channel. Um and be sure to send you a link to it.
Yeah, well, thank you all so much again for having me. And again, this was a fantastic conversation because this was so important because we're in the middle of Banned Books Week, but as we all probably know, Banned Books Week doesn't just end at Banned Books Week. We still keep talking about these things. So again,
Right.
thank you all so much for having me. Thank you for the amazing questions as well. And I will drop my email in the chat as well in case anyone wants to reach out to me outside of this. I'm always happy to talk about my work.
Did you graduate from Texas A&M?
I did my undergrad and my master's thesis at Texas A&M, and then I went to the University of Illinois for my
Okay.
PhD.
Yeah, my son graduated from ATM. He
Well,
graduated from A&M in 2013.
Yeah, I was 2017, so
Yeah,
just a
2017.
little bit before, a little bit after that, but
okay. Well, I can send
Wow.
everybody your contact info if you like.
I'll drop in the chat right there. So it should be
There
there,
we
but if
go.
not, yeah, Ariel, please feel free to share it with people because again, like I'm always happy to talk about these things. It's important. just talking more about these as folks. So again, thank you all so much again for having me.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks everybody for coming. Good night.